everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling Jack London of The Call of the Wild. But with a twist, we're going to explore all those real-life facts behind it. Think like going behind the scenes of how history inspired this classic.
Yeah, like a making-of documentary, but for a book. We're diving into some excerpts from a 1917 edition, specifically the introduction. It's loaded with details about the Klondike Gold Rush, sled dogs, even Jack London himself.
Okay, so picture this. The Klondike region up in northwest Canada. It's this super rugged, raw landscape, all carved out by the Yukon River. We're talking about key locations like Dawson City, a boomtown just bursting at the seams with gold fever. And then there's Skagway, the kind of dangerous entry point to this whole frozen frontier. Just imagine what those prospectors had to deal with.
Oh, it was brutal. I mean, just think. Treacherous mountain passes, freezing temperatures, and a landscape that could, change from this incredible beauty to deadly danger just like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't just the environment they were fighting. This was the late 1890s, right in the middle of the Klondike Gold Rush. So you've got thousands of people, all desperate to strike it rich, all pouring into this unforgiving territory.
Thousands. Wow. Talk about a pressure cooker. I can only imagine the competition, the desperation, everyone just trying to hit it big.
Absolutely. Resources were super scarce. Survival often came down to just pure grit, and this is key, the strength of your sled dogs. We're not talking about some, romanticized version of dogs from a novel. These animals were literally partners in survival, hauling supplies, equipment, even people across some of the most challenging terrain you could imagine.
Yeah, and when it comes to those dogs, London mentions huskies, Malamutes, and Mackenzie River dogs specifically. I mean, these weren't just any pups, right?
No, not at all. These dogs were bred for serious power, endurance, built to handle those sub-zero conditions. They were incredibly strong. Imagine these dog teams pulling sleds piled high with hundreds of pounds of gear across those vast frozen landscapes, day after day covering crazy distances, all while fighting the elements.
Wow. Okay, so you've got these crazy strong dogs hauling heavy sleds. What did those sleds actually look like? I'm picturing something pretty tough.
You're right, they were. Long, narrow, built for speed and to maneuver easily. And here's the cool part, they were often made with rawhide lashings, so they could be repaired on the fly, which, when you think about how remote everything was, is incredibly clever.
Makes sense. Yeah, you couldn't just, stop by the local hardware store for a quick fix out in the Klondike. But how were the dogs actually hooked up to the sled? It must have been more than just, tying them to a rope.
Oh, for sure. Much more complex. They used what's called a tandem harness, so the dogs would line up one after the other. Now, the lead dog, up front, that was the brains of the operation, setting the pace, navigating. Then you had the wheel dog, the one closest to the sled. They provided the extra power for those tough starts and hills, and the driver would control the whole thing with this long pole called a G-pole.
A G-pole? What's that?
Basically, it's a long pole used for steering, braking, or even like breaking out the sled if it got stuck frozen to the ground. Imagine the skill and strength needed to manage a whole team of dogs plus a loaded sled through that kind of terrain.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. And speaking of tough, all this talk about harsh conditions and backbreaking work makes me think about placer mining. London actually goes into some detail about that in the introduction, right?
He does. And it wasn't the glamorous gold panning you see in the movies. Placer mining was about separating gold from all the gravel and sand in riverbeds, often in freezing water. They used pans, sure, but also these things called sluice boxes. They're basically long, tilted troughs with these cleat-like things called riffles to catch the heavier gold. Incredibly laborious stuff.
Oh, sounds exhausting. But I guess that was the reality for those chasing gold. It makes you wonder, though, how did London know so much about all of this? Was he just a really dedicated researcher?
Oh, he was a fantastic researcher for sure. But his knowledge of the Klondike came from a much more personal place. Jack London actually lived through it. He went to the Klondike himself back in 1897, right in the thick of the gold rush.
Yeah, hold on. He actually went there. Wow. That's incredible. I mean, I knew he was adventurous, but I had no idea he had firsthand experience in the Klondike. That definitely changes how you see the Call of the Wild, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. His descriptions are so vivid and realistic. And it wasn't just the physical stuff either. London understood how that harsh environment impacted people, animals, mentally and emotionally. It was his own experiences that really shaped his writing, and that's why The Call of the Wild feels so authentic.
So he didn't just write about it, he lived it. That's amazing. Tell me a little more about London himself, though. Who was this guy before he went to the Klondike?
Well, his life story reads like an adventure novel itself. Born in San Francisco in 1876, he definitely seemed to inherit his father's adventurous spirit. Faced a lot of hardship early on and worked all sorts of jobs just to survive. Cannery worker, sailor, coal shoveler, you name it.
Wow, those are some tough gigs. Sounds like he had to really fight his way through life. But somewhere in there, he found the time and energy to become a writer. That's incredible. Do you think his upbringing and those early struggles influenced his writing?
Absolutely. You can see like echoes of his struggles in a lot of his characters, their resilience, that drive to overcome, even Buck in The Call of the Wild.
Yeah, like all those tough times forged this fire in him, and then that fire made its way onto the page. But it wasn't just hard work that shaped him. I read that he was a huge reader, mostly self-taught, which is pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah, totally. He had this incredible thirst for knowledge, like he was determined to educate himself, and his talent showed up early. He won a newspaper writing contest when he was only 16.
16. I was barely, forming coherent sentences at that age. Okay, so even with all that talent, it sounds like the Klondike was a major turning point for him. Would you say that's accurate?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't about striking gold literally. The experience itself was worth more than any nugget. London actually said it was in the Yukon I found myself.
And you can really feel that in his writing. The Call of the Wild isn't just an adventure. It's raw. It's like you can feel the icy wind on your face as you read.
Right. He captures the physical reality of the Northland, but also the psychological impact, how that harsh environment affects people, animals, it's all there. And that's where The Call of the Wild really shines.
Okay, so we've talked about the setting, the dogs, the harsh realities of placer mining, and even London's own journey. How does all of this connect to the story itself? What should our listener be thinking about when they read The Call of the Wild?
Think about the brutality of the Klondike, how important those dogs were for survival, and that constant push and pull between civilization and those primal instincts. It's all woven into the narrative. Buck's journey, going from a domesticated dog to a leader in the wild, mirrors what those venturing into the Klondike faced.
So Buck's journey is like a metaphor for the human experience in that unforgiving environment.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that The Call of the Wild isn't London's only story set in this world. He wrote plenty more inspired by his time in the North, like White Fang, which is interesting because it kind of flips the script. Instead of a dog going wild, White Fang is about this wild wolf dog becoming, well, civilized through human connection.
So it's like The Call of the Wild and White Fang are two sides of the same coin, Exploring that back and forth between the wild and the tame, the civilized and the primal.
Exactly. And both stories are so much richer when we understand what inspired them, that real-life context.
It's funny. We always talk about escaping into a good book, but in this case, learning about the real history makes that escape even better. It's like knowing the backstory of a movie or a song, suddenly it all makes sense and it hits you harder.
Totally agree. It's like those behind-the-scenes features on a DVD, but for a book, it adds a whole other layer to the experience.
You're not just reading about Buck anymore, you're picturing him next to the real dogs London knew, facing those same challenges, those primal urges. Makes you wonder how much of Buck's story came from the real dogs London saw, or the stories he heard around campfires.
Such a good point. It's impossible to know for sure, but it shows how London mixed reality and fiction to create this story that, still hits us so hard.
And it's not just about dogs either, right? Buck's journey reflects something about us, that human struggle for survival, that clash between who we're supposed to be and those deeper instincts.
For sure. That's what makes it so timeless. Most of us won't experience the Klondike, but we all face challenges. We all feel that pull between what's expected and what we really want.
So even though The Call of the Wild is set in this very specific time and place, the themes of the story are universal.
Exactly. That's why it still resonates with readers over 100 years later. It speaks to something deep inside us, that connection to nature, the desire for freedom, that struggle to find our place in the world.
I love that. The Call of the Wild isn't just an adventure story. It's about what it means to be human.
It really is. And it makes us ask some big questions about who we are, what motivates us, what it means to truly live.
Now, those are some deep thoughts. But before we go full-on existential, let's bring it back to our listeners. What's the one big takeaway you'd want them to leave with from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember that The Call of the Wild is way more than just a thrilling adventure. It's rooted in real history, inspired by London's life and what he saw. When we understand that context, the story just becomes so much more meaningful.
It's not just reading the words, it's understanding the world behind those words.
Exactly. And that understanding lets us connect with the story on a whole other level, maybe even see ourselves in Buck's journey.
Makes you wonder, does that call of the wild still, exist for us today? I mean, we're not exactly mushing sleds across frozen landscapes, but don't we all feel that pull sometimes, that urge for freedom to break away from, like, everyday life?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it gets right to why the call of the wild still matters today.
Hmm.
We might not be fighting to survive like Buck, but those instincts, wanting something more, something wilder, it's still a part of us.
It's like London is tapping into something universal, even though the story is set in this very specific, extreme setting.
Yeah, totally. It's a story about transformation, about pushing our boundaries, and ultimately figuring out who we are, stripped down to the basics. And those themes connect with people no matter when they live.
I like that. So it's not just adventure, it's about self-discovery, finding your true nature.
Exactly. And it asks us, what would we do if we were in Buck's paws? How would we answer that call of the wild?
Those are some big questions. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the final thought you'd leave our listeners with? What should they think about as they go about their day? Maybe even pick up the call of the wild.
I say, think about how those themes we've talked about, the pull of the wild, the fight to survive, the power of instinct, how those might be playing out in your own life. Even in small ways, maybe it's that urge to break free from routine or explore something new or connect with nature more deeply. Whatever it is, the call of the wild reminds us to embrace that wildness inside us and to never stop exploring those untamed parts of ourselves.
Wow, that's a beautiful way to put it. So, to our listeners, as you go about your day, think about those moments when you feel that spark of adventure, that desire for something more. Maybe it's time to answer your own call of the wild. And who knows, maybe this deep dive has inspired you to check out The Call of the Wild again, or even explore some other stories by Jack London. There's a whole world of adventure waiting out there in those pages.
And remember, keep those sources coming. We're here to help you dig out those hidden gems. Until next time, happy reading.